My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and would like to welcome you to this special event. In a way, it's an annual event that we do to announce the results of the Arab Opinion Index. And of course, this year is the latest of the Arab Opinion Index, which will be presented to you in a bit with a little bit more information by our presenter. This is for the results of the poll that was conducted 2017-2018 with an emphasis by us about the gap, if you will, that's quite visible when you look at the results of the survey, and it will become hopefully visible to all of you after the presentation, the gap that exists between public opinion in the Arab world and official policy. That's why we kind of chose that as a subtitle for our presentation today, our panel today. We have three people participating in our panel today, a speaker who will be presenting the actual results of the survey, and then two commentators, our own Washington-based Dr. Shibley Telhami and Dr. Tamara Kharroub, who will be participating or commenting on the results. But let me, again, you have the bios of all three in the flyer that you received as you entered the room. But I would like to just take a couple of minutes to introduce our special presenter today, Dr. Dana Al-Kurd, who's our colleague from the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, Qatar, and we are very grateful to her for taking that trip with the jet lag involved in this long 13-hour plus flight from Doha to here and going back, considering the fact that she was just in the country a week ago here and went back and came back again to honor this commitment. So we really appreciate that. Dana is a researcher at the Arab Center in Doha. As I said, she received her PhD in government from the University of Texas in Austin, and she specializes in both comparative politics and international relations. She's been very much interested in international involvement and authoritarianism within the Arab world, which is, of course, directly related to some of the issues that we will be discussing today, particularly as we reveal how the average Arab citizen in these countries, particularly the 11 countries that we have surveyed in this particular poll, have responded to the questions. So after Dana spends about 25 or so minutes presenting the results of the survey or the poll, we will turn the microphone on to our dear friend Shibley Telhami, who's actually on the academic advisory board of the center. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. And for most of you, if not all of you, he's well known as a person who has spent definitely more than a decade doing these types of public opinion surveys, not only in the region, but about the region even here in the United States. So his commentary, I think, would be welcome and appreciated with regards to the results of the survey. And then after Shibley, we'll give him 12 minutes. We will also give equal time to our own Tamara Kharroub. Tamara is the Assistant Director of Arab Center Washington. Basically, she has focused her research on democratization in the Middle East and transition, violent extremism, gender issues, countering violent extremism in the region in terms of U.S. foreign policy in general in the Middle East, with an emphasis, of course, on democracy and Arab-Israeli matters. Tamara holds a PhD from Indiana University. After all three finish their presentations, we will be delighted to spend the balance of our time in Q&A. So we will have about 30 minutes for you to interact with the panelists, and there are cards on your seats with pencils. Please indicate on the card your name, your affiliation, and legibly ask a question. So we can read your question. If you would like it directed to a specific panelist, please indicate that. If not, you can direct it to all three. And let's go ahead at this time and turn the microphone to Dana Al-Kurd. Dana, welcome. Thank you.
All right. Hello. I don't think this is. Oh, no, it's on. Okay. Thank you so much for. I will attempt. I'm just very short. Okay, there we go. Thank you all so much for coming this morning, and thank you to the Arab Center in DC for putting this together and hosting me. And yeah, the jet lag issue is really my bad planning. So thank you again for having me. So I'm going to be giving kind of an overview of the 2017-2018 Arab Opinion Index, which is our largest Arab public opinion project. And basically what I'm going to do is, for those who are unfamiliar with the index, I'm going to give an introduction to what it is and its sections, and then I'm going to give kind of 3 in-depth looks at the data using the example of Arab public opinion regarding the United States, Arab public opinion on the Palestinian issue, and gauging public opinion under authoritarian contexts and the challenges we face doing that. And the last section of my presentation, I'm going to provide some resources on how to access Arab Opinion Index data and analysis pieces. So the theme here is that we believe Arab public opinion counts for a variety of reasons, and that the Arab Opinion Index is a good tool for gauging and utilizing this data. So the Arab Opinion Index, for those who are unfamiliar, is an Arab-led public opinion survey coming out of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, and it's the largest public opinion survey on the Arab world. We develop our battery of questions so that it's relevant to our context and region through an iterative process of pilot surveys, focus groups, and in-depth interviews. And we're informed by other relevant surveys. So, you know, other people who might poll in the Middle East or outside the Middle East, we're up to date on the literature on survey methods and best practices, but we don't ever translate survey questions from other surveys and just, you know, impose them on the Middle Eastern context. We really try our best to do something that's very indigenous. And basically, we have a firm belief that Arab public opinion matters, like I said. So when countries like the United States rely on regime rhetoric or the opinions of political elite to make decisions, they'll not be able to construct effective long-term policy. So we want to bring, you know, what Arab citizens really think to the forefront and make it, you know, possibly easier for people to construct policy in a better way. Okay, so in terms of our sampling, sampling is where you pick subgroups from a larger group that's the target population. And so we use a randomized, stratified, multi-stage, self-weighted clustered approach, which gives an overall margin of error of 2 to 3% for each individual country. And we use probability proportional to size sampling, which basically takes varying sample sizes into account. So this helps to avoid underrepresenting a particular subgroup in a study and yields more accurate results overall. So usually we have between 12 to 16 countries in any given year, but it kind of depends on the geopolitical context. So this year we had 11 countries that we surveyed in conjunction with our local partners, and we had over 18,000 respondents this year. The fieldwork was carried out by an overall team of 840 individuals, which we balanced on gender, who conducted 45,000 hours of face-to-face interviews. And this was happening concurrently in the different countries that we surveyed. So I know you guys have the in-brief document, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the sections of the Arab Opinion Index to illustrate the richness of the data that we have. I couldn't possibly go over all of the data that we have. Would be here all week. So I'm just going to give like 2 or 3 examples for each section, kind of illustrate the depth of knowledge that we can have using this survey, and then we'll go into the in-depth examples. Okay, so the first section deals with living conditions of Arab citizens. So it asks questions on economic conditions, how they perceive security conditions, political conditions, kind of just general, where are you at? So basically this question here is, how would you describe the general economic situation in your home country? And it's broken down by the individual countries that we surveyed this year. So, you know, we can kind of get a sense of where Arab citizens are struggling the most from their perception. We also have in this section questions on immigration. So we have open-ended questions where we ask them, why do you want to immigrate? Where would you like to immigrate? These kinds of more in-depth questions. But the question up here has basically just a yes or no question. Do you wish to immigrate? Broken down by country. And we also have it broken down by gender, age, and other demographic factors. It's a useful tool to be able to gauge opinions on this topic and trends. Now, Section 2 covers perceptions of state institutions. So things like how they perceive state capacity, their trust in different parts of the government, et cetera, et cetera. So this question here is on the performance of the legislature. So we ask them whether they believe the legislature in their country does a good enough job holding the executive responsible for its policies and actions. So we can also kind of look at this, since we do have this rich data over time, we can look at how people view this over time. This is just a yearly breakdown. And we also ask in this section about corruption. So this graph here shows a yearly comparison of the question on how prevalent corruption is in their home countries. And so in aggregate, we see that maybe that perception was higher in 2012 than it was in 2017, for example. Okay, and the next section, Section 3, deals with attitudes towards democracy. This is kind of my favorite section. It's pretty interesting. So we ask about democracy directly, but given the authoritarian context of many of these countries, it might be difficult to ask that question directly and get an accurate result. We have a lot of acquiescence bias in our respondents. So basically, we also ask about different components of democracy and how they perceive those different components. So we might ask them, what do you think of democracy? But we might also ask them, what do you think of political parties participating? What do you think, different kinds of definitions of democracy. So for example, here, we can compare definitions of democracy across the Middle East based on the most prevalent responses to our open-ended question. So for example, we find that generally speaking in the total aggregate, they have a pretty clear understanding of what democracy means. They think that democracy is defined as a system that preserves civil and public liberties. It's a system that preserves equality and justice for all citizens. It's a system that has a peaceful transfer of power. So Arab citizens in aggregate actually truly understand what democracy constitutes. We also find that a majority of respondents disagree with a set of statements which characterize democracy negatively across the Arab world. So for example, much of the propaganda or the kind of the stereotypes that authoritarian regimes will engage in is that our society is unprepared for democracy, and we really need to maybe get somewhere economically before we can think about representation or all of these things. But what we find is that the vast majority of Arabs will disagree with these statements, especially the statement that democracy is incompatible with Islam. We also have respondents assess every year the levels of democracy in their countries, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest. So we have a gauge of public perception on that issue. And we have this broken down by country as well, but this is the aggregate. So in 2017, 2018, the aggregate Arabs, the whole survey basically ranks the level of democracy as at 5.5 out of 10. And finally, we also asked the question of how whether or not they're able to criticize their governments. Using a sliding scale, again, with 1 being the least able to criticize the government and 10 being the most able. The average number was 5.6 regionally, with respondents in Saudi Arabia predictably being the least able to criticize, and respondents in Lebanon, Tunisia being the most able. So this is a really fun section. It's got a lot of interesting results. Now, Section 4, we gauge civic and political participation. So, for example, in this section, we ask about political apathy, level of political apathy over time. So that's what you see here. We find that it is, consistently high political apathy, and that's kind of, understandable given the situation in the Middle East and a lot of these countries. We also have questions on how they participate and how much they participate. So less than weekly, monthly, we can kind of get a sense of their participation levels. This question here looks at respondent engagement with different kinds of civil society organizations. So voluntary or charitable organizations, family-based associations, religious associations. Overall, there's not a lot of participation. But again, that makes sense given the context. And finally, in this section, we also have an assessment of media. So we have a battery of questions on how much they consume media, where they get their news, for what reasons they use this particular source versus that particular source. We have an assessment of particular news sources in the Arab world, so like a comparison of the BBC with Al Jazeera, with Al Arabiya. So like it's a very rich battery of questions, and that's what this question looks at, is whether or not where they get their news from. So we find, for example, in Lebanon, they use satellite TV more than in Kuwait, that relies more on online sources. So for those interested in that dynamic as well, this is very important. Okay, section 5. Basically, section 5 deals with religiosity and religion in politics. So we have questions on how people define religiosity. Is it attending the mosque every week? Is it praying 5 times a day? Whether they themselves would define themselves as religious, and how much. And then the role religion should play in politics. So this question here shows self-identified religiosity. And consistently speaking, the vast majority of Arab citizens are either very religious or religious to some extent. So that's what we find here. And then this question here gauges their perception of the role of religion in politics. So we asked them if they agreed or disagreed with the idea that it would be better for their home country if religion was separated from politics. And we can see there's a bit of polarization on this issue. But a slim majority agrees that religion should be separated from politics. This is, in spite of the fact that most people identify as religious, but this is kind of where they see religion and politics playing out. Now, section 6 is, bear with me, we're almost done with the sections. Section 6 is about inter-Arab relations and foreign relations. So in this section, we asked them about relationships between different Arab countries, like, for example, whether they view themselves as a single nation. Here we see that over time, a sizable majority of Arab citizens identified with the idea that the Arab people constitute a single nation. So in 2017, 2018, for example, 77% of the respondents supported the sentiment that various Arab peoples formed a single nation, and only 19% said that, we only have tenuous bonds. We also asked them about foreign policy. We have assessments of different foreign policy. We asked them about specific countries, whether or not they perceive different countries in terms of their foreign policies towards the Middle East as positive or negative. Here we see Iran. Generally speaking, it's viewed very negatively across a variety of different foreign policy issues, whether it's Palestine or Libya or Syria. Arabs view Iranian intervention in the region as negative. And this allows us also to compare across different countries. So here's the Iranian graph, and then here's the Turkish graph. And we can see here, for example, that Turkey is viewed much more positively than Iran in terms of foreign policy. And finally, the last section is Arab opinions towards ISIS and comparable terrorist groups. So we ask questions regarding whether they support ISIS objectives, how they perceive ISIS objectives, why they think people are recruited into ISIS, what remedies they think could solve this manifestation of terrorist groups. So, for example, we can look at cross-tabulations of different questions. In this case here, up at the screen, we look at their response to one of the questions on the role of religion in politics, and with whether or not they have a positive or negative view of ISIS. So we can see here that their idea of religion in politics is actually not a determinant of their support or rejection of ISIS. The vast majority reject, 95 and 96. There's not a statistically significant difference between the two groups, whether they believe that religion should be separated from politics or not. So it's clear that most people kind of outright reject ISIS across the region. And we can see from these questions on ISIS and comparable groups that people understand these groups are really a manifestation of political problems, rather than anything to do with religion necessarily. So we ask open-ended questions about how to remedy the problem of these terrorist groups kind of emerging in the Middle East. And we find that the top reasons include spreading democracy, resolving underlying sources of conflict like the Palestinian issue, and ending foreign intervention in the region. So now that I've given you an overview that you'll look into your in-brief results and you can delve into it as much as you like. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give 3 more in-depth examples of the data, starting with the Arab opinion of US policy. Now, not a shocker, sorry. Arab opinion of US foreign policy is very negative compared to other nations. So Israel and the US are the 2 main threats as perceived by the Arab publics we surveyed. Israel at 90% and the USA at 84%. So they consider these 2 countries as the main threats in the region. And U.S. is by far the most negatively perceived compared to other nations. So when we look at U.S. foreign policy in comparison with, say, Turkish or Chinese or French, it's on the lowest ranked, right behind Iran. And when asked to look at specific U.S. foreign policy areas, the vast majority of Arabs had negative views of U.S. policy towards Palestine, which is 87% this year, up from 79% last year. And that makes sense given the recent Trump administration shifts in policy. They perceive American foreign policy towards Syria negatively by 81% and Iraq by 82%. And what's clear from this data is that, and other questions that we include in the survey, is that Arabs have a negative view of American policy. It's not just inherent anti-American sentiment. It's really tied to shifts in how American foreign policy plays out in the region. Okay, the second example of how we can use our data effectively is the section on Arab opinion towards the Palestinian cause. So like I said, Israel is seen as the biggest threat in the region. 90% of Arabs identify Israel as being the top threat in the region. And despite recent talks of opening up diplomatic relations between different countries, between authoritarian Arab regimes and the State of Israel, Arabs have been consistent over the years in their refusal of opening up diplomatic relations. So there's not really a statistically significant difference between 2011 and 2017, 2018. It's between 84 to 87%. The vast majority of Arabs reject diplomatic relations with Israel. So when we asked respondents, please elaborate on their disapproval in an open-ended question, why do you disapprove? The majority that opposed diplomatic ties between their countries and Israel highlighted factors such as Israeli racism towards Palestinians and its expansionist policies. A minority of respondents also named Israeli racism towards other Arabs, as well as its role in regional instability as a reason for their opposition. And among the minority who accepted recognition of Israel by their governments, their reasons were also nuanced. In a similar open-ended question, basically half of the minority that accept diplomatic relations with Israel made such recognition conditional on the formation of an independent Palestinian state. So from these open-ended justifications for both people who support or reject recognition, we find that political reasons were the most salient for both groups. But it is sometimes argued, especially in American media, that opposition to Israel does not necessarily mean support of the Palestinian cause. Arab opposition to Israel is really just painted maybe sometimes in religious terms, or it's claimed as being as a result of some inherent anti-Semitism. But our data shows that across self-identified religiosity levels, the majority of respondents oppose recognition of Israel, no matter how religious they may be. So here we find that there's no statistically significant difference between people who claim that they're very religious to people who are not adherent to any religion at all. Both groups reject diplomatic relations with Israel. And so clearly, religiosity or narratives of like Islam versus Judaism are not the reason behind this rejection. Okay, moreover, our data shows that Arab opposition to Israel is actually strongly linked to their support of the Palestinian cause. So more than 3/4 of respondents in the latest survey agree that the Palestinian cause concerns all Arabs and not just Palestinians alone. So that's down a little bit from the first time we asked the question, but still an overwhelming majority. And most Arabs we surveyed also disapprove of the various peace treaties signed between a number of Arab states and Israel, including the Oslo agreements between Palestine Liberation Organization and Israel, the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, and the Wadi Araba agreement between Israel and Jordan. So again, through open-ended questions, we find that their disapproval is politically motivated. So because of none of these agreements have led Palestinians closer to self-determination, that's why Arabs mostly oppose these agreements. We also have the first question related to whether the Palestinian cause is a cause for all Arabs, broken down by country. So predictably, countries with more internal conflict are more likely to have higher rates of people responding that Palestine is only a Palestine issue. But overall, the majority of Arabs say that the Palestinian cause concerns all of them. And finally, the third example I'm going to go over that's kind of tied to what I just discussed is gauging public opinion in authoritarian contexts and how we get around those challenges. So Arab regimes, again, not a shocker, are very authoritarian for a variety of historical and structural reasons. And because of this, there's a disconnect between regime policy and public opinion in a lot of these countries that's often not picked up by other surveys. So like I said, you can't really ask direct questions all the time. You have to ask them because it's kind of a gauge of just a basic level of things, but you need further analysis and you need to use particular survey methods to be able to gauge accurate assessments of public opinion. So I'm going to use Saudi Arabia as an example. In Saudi Arabia today, we have a recent repressive crackdown on civil society that's unprecedented in the last 2 decades. There's also been shifts at the regime level in their rhetoric towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. So there's been some trial balloons in the media that it's the Palestinians that are being problematic and they need to accept, and what's wrong with recognizing Israel. These kinds of things are happening behind the scenes. And so for the first time since 2011 in Saudi Arabia, we had difficulty posing questions on Palestine. So when we asked a question regarding whether or not the Palestinian cause was important to Saudis, 36% said that they don't know or refused to answer. We also had a lot of people quit the survey. We had a high attrition rate versus an approximately 5% non-response rate in the rest of the countries sampled. So it's a very high non-response rate. So for that reason, we need to use different kinds of survey methods to be able to gauge how Saudi Arabians think. If we just took that, we would assume Saudi Arabians don't care about Palestine and that their government's propaganda is working and they're totally on board with what Mohammed bin Salman is doing. But what we find is that if we use a list experiment, we have different results. Now, a list experiment is a particular survey method that's used to elicit true feelings regarding sensitive issues. So respondents in our experiment were asked to list the number of items in a question that were important to them. So how many of these items are important to you? Don't tell me which ones, just tell me the number. So one half of the sample was randomly assigned a question with 4 items with varying levels of importance. And then the second half of the sample was given a question with 5 items. That 5th item was the Palestinian cause. So if there's a difference between the number of items chosen in the first half of the sample and the second half of the sample, we know that that inclusion of the 5th item is why there's a difference. Basically, like I said there, if there's a statistically significant difference. And what we find is that, indeed, there is a statistically significant difference. The average number of items chosen in the 4-item question was 2.079, and the average number of items chosen in the 5-item question was 2.815. And this was statistically significant at the highest level. So this gives us reason to believe that the Palestinian cause remains important to the Saudi sample, but that fear of responding truthfully explains the lack of response and the high attrition rate. Because if it wasn't important to them, adding that 5th item wouldn't matter. We would have the same, there wouldn't be any statistically significant differences between the 2 halves of the sample. So that's one example. The second example is Egypt. So in Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came to power with a supposed 97% of the electorate's votes. But consensus amongst human rights organizations is that these were sham elections because he put all of his opponents in jail, so he ran unopposed. So it's difficult in, say, like a situation like Egypt to ask direct questions and get a result. We have something called acquiescence bias, where they assume you want to hear something positive about the government, so they answer positively, overwhelmingly. So this is a concept we call preference falsification. So in authoritarian context, the act of misrepresenting one's wants under perceived social pressure, in this case, perceived crackdown from the state. So when we ask them about their trust in government or their trust in the president or overall political conditions, it's actually positive, even though we know the conditions in Egypt are very negative. And this could be due to a number of reasons. It could be that the Sisi regime's propaganda is working because Sisi paints himself as somebody who wants to bring back security and stability after the Arab Spring, especially because there have been some threats, some security threats to the state that have emerged in certain areas of Egypt. So maybe people are, truly thinking that this is working and Sisi has their support. But also the repression factor, it can't be, understated. Egyptians are unlikely to share negative opinions of their state and so might be exaggerating positive perceptions. We have different ways of getting around that. We've done particular tests similar to the one that I showed you with Saudi Arabia. But when we ask Egyptians their support of democracy as a system directly, still 76% of them will say that democracy is the best regime for their country. Now, when we ask about components of democracy, like I said, when you don't ask directly, but you ask about, you ask about democracy without actually using the word. So this, how much would you support a system where all political parties are allowed to compete freely? That number jumps up to 91%. So we understand that the wording of questions can sometimes matter, and direct questions may not be the best option. So we ask questions in different ways to gauge opinion accurately in these kinds of contexts. And we find proof of this further when we look at this is the Egyptian sample, so respondent opinions of political parties. So in 2017, 2018, the majority of respondents agreed that political parties are necessary to preserve freedom of choice for citizens and maintain a variety of political opinions in the public sphere. And this is the highest it's been in previous years. So it's kind of a growing support for democracy even. So to conclude, I've given you a lot to think about and chew on. Yeah, I'm done. I'm almost done. So the Arab Opinion Index's comparative advantage is we create measures that capture underlying persistent problems in the Arab world using a highly contextualized knowledge of our cases. And we have yearly measures of a variety of variables. So we don't just ask about like current events, like those opinions might change quickly. We ask about particular questions over time. So we have a lot of rich data that we can kind of trace over time. And we utilize our in-depth knowledge of the cases, rigorous testing of question wording, and experimental analysis, like the example I showed you, to arrive at the most accurate assessment of public opinion, despite the authoritarian context that we work under. Now, in my last couple of slides, I'm just going to give you guys some resources on how to access the data. One is the reports that are available in English and Arabic on our website. The second is the new dashboard tool I'll discuss in the coming slides. And the last is the Arab Opinion Index analysis pieces that come out with every issue of Siyasat Arabiya, which is for Arabic speakers, or Al-Muntaqa, which is for English speakers, both of which are open access academic journals. And I'll talk more about that in the slides ahead. So the dashboard is a new tool, a new online tool that we're going to be releasing on our website very soon, and it's going to have all the data from 2011 to 2017 so that you can look at it and play around with it and download graphs that are relevant to your research or your reporting. There will be 3 different dashboards that allow you to look at the data differently. So I've taken screenshots of the dashboard. But basically, the first dashboard looks like this. It looks at a single question, the selected question, over time and over particular demographics, so age, gender, and educational level. And you can pick whatever question you want. You can restrict the year that you want to look at it, the countries you want to look at, and it's, again, interactive, so as you switch, you can see the shifts over time. It has Arabic up there, but it will all be available in English as well. The second dashboard looks at a year-by-year comparison, so you can look at the question over time. And again, you can always restrict the country. In this one, we've restricted it to Palestine. But again, it's interactive. You can kind of pick the ones you want to do. And finally, the last dashboard allows you to look at compare 2 questions over time, so like a cross-tabulation. So if you think, for example, economic grievance has an effect on trust in government, which is the first and second question that's selected there. You can look at how these questions relate to each other. So it's a fun tool to use if you just want a quick look at something. And finally, we've recently released our English language journal. It's called Al-Muntaqa, which translates to selections. So it's open access on JSTOR. That's the URL right there, or you can just Google it, Muntaqa. But basically what this English journal is that it has translations of our Arabic language research that has come out in some of our Arabic language academic journals. But like some of the most interesting ones that we think that maybe an English-speaking audience might want easier access to. But in every edition of Al-Muntaqa, there's also a short analysis piece using the Arab Opinion Index data. So if you want to see kind of, let's say there's a particular current event and the Arab Opinion Index data will release a short analysis piece using their data on Egyptian elections or whatever it might be, this might be a good resource to use as well. All right, I think that's my time. Thank you so much for your attention this morning, and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate your extensive coverage of the different sections of a very large survey, and there is plenty of food for thought, which we will come back to during the Q&A, hopefully. At this time, we'd like to pass the microphone to Dr. Shibley Telhami to comment on the results of the survey from his perspective as a scholar and also as a very experienced pollster in the region and about the region. Shibley?
Well, thanks very much. Thank you, Dana. That was an excellent overview. And thank you for holding this series of polls because, frankly, you could understand from just summarizing how much it takes to carry out such a large poll, all the resources and effort that takes and the hundreds of people that get involved. Very few people can do it. And And fewer people are doing it in the Arab world in this environment where it's difficult to carry out. You have the Pew Global Poll, which of course includes sometimes questions from the Arab and Muslim countries. I stopped doing my regular poll in the Arab world in 2012 that I did annually for 10 years. The Arab American Institute still carries out a smaller poll in fewer Arab countries. When I did mine, they were in 6 countries. This is in 11 countries. So this is really helpful for us to understand what's happening in the Arab world. I look forward to a much more detailed analysis because this, by default, is an overview and an executive summary. The most interesting stuff is in the variations. Arab countries are not the same, and you will see that in some of the data that has been presented, but a lot of the data that hasn't been presented, where the differences among Arab states is large on some issues. And as the report says specifically, on some issues, particularly pertaining to governments, the same countries are polarized and heavily divided. Just as we are, as every other country in the world is right now, so is the case in Arab countries. I'd like to see more analysis of the role, gender and age. Obviously, I know that this is coming. This is obviously a summary. This is a release. But the in-depth study, I assume, would have all of that, and that would give us much more flavor. That would be very helpful. So keep that in mind. This is just a quick summary rather than, because it's very rich data here to analyze. So let me just go over some of the findings and some of the thoughts that I have about 4 clusters, basically 2 that have to do with domestic politics and 2 that have to do with foreign policy, and relate them a little bit to my own findings from over 5-6 years ago in the Arab world. How has that changed or has not changed in many ways? One thing that hasn't changed, obviously, is what we talk about often is the gap between publics and governments. That has always been the case. We find it in public opinion polls. It's still there. It hasn't gone away. But to get into more details, let me start with some of the findings, particularly about sort of the sources of discontent in Arab countries and and sort of the wanting to immigrate. The percentage is pretty high in some countries. Again, here you find huge deviation. For example, in the Sudan and Morocco and Jordan, you find a lot of people, a majority, who say the economy is the #1 problem. In Saudi Arabia, you find very few people who will say the economy is the main problem. So while you're getting a report of the 33% who say the economy is #1, which is basically an averaging out of the 11 countries, there's huge deviation across the Arab world with regard to what are the sources of discontent even. And in that regard, there's a large number of people who want to leave. I mean, obviously you find that in Sudan, but you find it even in Morocco. 41% of Moroccans say they wish to immigrate to another country. You find 35% in Jordan who say they want to immigrate. In Palestine, 26%, which is roughly the average of the entire Arab world. We don't know. They have the data on the breakdown between Gaza, West Bank. I assume there's a big divide there. I don't know for sure. That data apparently is available. I'd love to see it when it comes out. I haven't seen the open-ended question about why people want to immigrate. I want to see that. Open-ended questions are tough to summarize. It takes forever because people can give anything at all. And when you have that sort of large data, it's so difficult. You have to categorize it. It takes a long time. But nonetheless, we have some indication because you can look at the just immediate, it doesn't have to be what they think is driving them. You could look at it by what the sources of discontent are. You could do a quick correlation. And just looking at it, eyeballing it, I could tell that the high degree of the countries where you have a large number of people who want to immigrate are the countries where economic issue is the biggest source of discontent. But that may not be true. Of course, this is just eyeballing it. I haven't analyzed it. but I'd love to see that data. What is the correlation? Is it political discontent? Is it economic discontent? What's the difference? That's something I would love to see. Second issue is the one on democracy and governance. This is interesting because I think the findings of this poll really confirm other findings that we've had on democracy, that Arabs, even though they don't have a first-hand experience with democracy, or most of them don't, they actually know what democracy roughly is, at least conceptually. Whether they know it experientially is another story, but they know it at least conceptually. We see that in the indicators here about what's important for a democracy in their own view. And that correlates with our own polling back in 10 years that I did the polling, when we asked Arabs to identify which countries are most democratic in open-ended questions. Just to run which are the most democratic. So that gives you a sense of what is their kind of a point of reference about what democracy is. All the countries were Western European countries, the U.S. And Japan. There was nothing. So you know that when they're thinking democracy, they're thinking roughly Western democracy. That's what they mean by it. There is no question about that in their mind. A related question is about their ability to criticize government. Now, this is really interesting for a variety of reasons. If you look at that question, one of the places where they say their ability to criticize the government is low is remarkably Palestine. Palestine on that, if you look at the comparison, where ability to criticize government, yes or no, which is just a choice. Tunisia is the highest place where they say the ability is there, 81%, and at the bottom is Sudan, 26%, and Palestine, 38%, just below Saudi Arabia at 40%. Now remember, with Saudi Arabia, as Dana said, one of the interesting things is not just on the question that she cited, on this question or other questions, there's a large number of don't answer or don't know. In this particular case, I think it's a pretty large number. I think it's 27%. In some cases, it goes up to 40% of people who don't know or don't answer. An aberration, really different from the rest of the 11 countries in terms of people's willingness to answer the question. But I'd want to know why that is. That is remarkable. Particularly, and I'd want to know, obviously, the breakdown, Gaza versus the West Bank. That is very telling, but this is something to look for and think about a little bit more. A final question in this cluster is the sources of news. I mean, it bears on the question of democracy, and I'll tell you why I think that is the case. What has been interesting, obviously, watching the information revolution that some of us thought was a key to the timing of the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011, is the question of the rise of the internet and social media as a new source of news, at least, if not a source of organization as well. And when you look at the sources of news, is still, by and large, satellite television is king in the Arab world, except in the GCC, in the two countries here, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, where it's getting about even. In Saudi Arabia, maybe even closer, more than that, when it comes to the role of internet versus satellite. That's important because, as you know, there's a whole debate that relates to public opinion, which is are the TV stations or satellite television, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, Egyptian TV, are they shaping public opinion, or are people watching the stations that reflect their opinion? Are people going to those stations that reflect public opinion? And with it, is the television still important? Or is it really now social media that has taken over? This is kind of passé. Well, we know it's not passé. Even in those countries in the Gulf where social media is rising or internet is rising, it's still very important for satellite. The question remains whether the media is shaping public opinion or not. And as you know, that a lot of the countries, particularly those who are boycotting Qatar and asking for, essentially an end to Al Jazeera as we know it, are saying this is Al Jazeera is doing. This is like public opinion is being shaped by, the evidence I had in the past where I did a correlation between sources of news and public opinion, I found no such correlation at all. And I subscribe to the position that people go to the stations that reflect their core views on issues that matter to their identity much more than the other way around. But this is a battle that is ongoing in the Middle East because you have people, rulers, governments who think you can actually control the information revolution, you could shape public opinion, you can, whether through social media or satellite television, watch this issue. It's important. Let me just cover the two foreign policy issues. I want to start with the question of Palestine, particularly because obviously, it's a central one in the debate, and there is a sense that its importance has declined in the Arab world, certainly for Arab governments. Has it declined for Arab people? We don't have enough of an answer in this particular survey. And the reason for it is we don't really have a repeat of questions that we have done in the past to tell you how people prioritize the question of Palestine. Now, Palestine is, I don't think anyone disputes the fact that Palestine remains part of Arab identity, and that shows here, right? Because no one wants to say it's just only for the Palestinians. Majority in every country say Palestine is for all Arabs. It still is. I believe that. I don't think it's just people are saying it. The real question is it a priority enough for it to matter? Will people act on it? Will they make their governments pay if the governments deviate from it? We don't have an answer to that here. In the past, we have had a kind of test that suggested that they prioritize this issue high. This is not clear. Particularly, it's a debatable question, but it's not clear. And the same thing with the question about normalizing relations with Israel. We know that a majority, as the question was asked, say no. To then present an open-ended question as to why, that is really problematic, because open-ended questions on a question like that is so difficult. I would have forced them to choose, even if you create 10 questions that are formulated better, you could tell. And frankly, when you cluster occupation and treatment of Palestinians together, I don't know whether they refer to occupation of the West Bank and Gaza or controlling of all of historic Palestine. It's hard to tell, and it makes a huge difference. It doesn't tell me the answer. So there, I would tease it out. Now, obviously, if you have your open-ended question, once you tabulate them, perhaps more, refine them rather than cluster them, you might have more answers, but I certainly would want to know that. Let me end with the question about American foreign policy. Now, it is interesting. It was actually fascinating to me because we had in the past, over the years, said it can't get any worse. It can't get any worse. It can't get any worse, and it does get worse. So it's really quite stunning, actually, when you look at that way, both in terms of their favorable, unfavorable views of American foreign policy, but also in terms of ranking American foreign policy in comparison to other countries. That is striking that the U.S. is lowest of all these countries, but it's also striking that Turkey is still high despite the divide on Turkey in the Arab world, and that China, which had in previous polls also shown that it had, its image is improving, is up there. That is telling. But the core question here is about the Iran issue, and I want to end with that. And that is, there's a battle going on about what is, the new Middle East, where Iran is the biggest threat, and it's no longer the Israel-Palestine question that is central, and that all of this realignment is happening to confront an Iranian threat. Now, in my previous polls that I've done throughout from 2002 all the way to 2012, the ranking of the threat was roughly the same as here, which is Israel number one, the US is second, Iran is third across the Arab world. So this is very much the same as it was in the past. It's not very different. What is a little different, though, and this is something that needs to be teased out, is that when you break it down country by country, and you look at GCC countries, in Kuwait, it still holds, even in Kuwait, as a GCC country that is neighboring Iran, it's still Israel number one, US number two, Iran number three. But when you look at Saudi Arabia, that is the big question, right? Because that's what where the Saudi, is the Saudi public in harmony with their government? The first thing to note is that on that question, the largest group, 41%, don't answer or say don't know. So people avoid answering this question. But of those who answer, 37% say Iran, and 10% say Israel, and 3% say the US. Now, here is an interesting question about whether is this, an issue related to the methodology, or is it an issue about the media working, or is it an issue about... That was not the case in 2011. In 2011, Saudis still ranked Iran as the third, Saudi citizens still ranked Iran as the third threat after Israel and the US. So here, this is a little bit different. That brings me to the final methodological issue, which Dana talked about in terms of testing in places like Saudi Arabia, whether people are answering or not answering. I think it's an innovative way. I think it's really clever, and I like the approach. I want to look at it a little bit more closely to see the results. But if you're going to do it in Saudi Arabia, you have to do it in every other country. You can't just isolate Saudi Arabia because you're assuming that the public is more. I mean, why wouldn't it be the case that some other country is answering that Israel is the biggest threat because of media, if you assume. So you really have to do it consistently. You can't just isolate that, and that will undermine the results by just looking at it as just Saudi Arabia. But it's really fascinating poll, and I look forward to looking at the fine details of the data.
Thank you, Shibley, for your great comments and recommendations. And now we give the last word to Tamara, who has 10 to 12 minutes to comment on some of her key points that she found in the survey.
Thank you, Khalil, and thanks, Dana, for presenting these really interesting findings, and thanks to Shibley for the insights. I would like to start by really mentioning that an important part of the mission, our mission at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., is to provide Arab perspectives to U.S. policymaking. And a survey of this scale, like the Arab Opinion Index, provides important insights about really what the Arab public thinks and what the Arab public wants. Because this is often outweighed by the views and positions of leaders in the region in policy conversations. In my remarks, I will just comment on a few items that I found interesting in the findings. I'll try to do that without repeating what has already been said. The first set of things that I would like to discuss relate to democracy and political participation in the region. And the second, briefly, the question of Palestine, because it's a current affairs issue. And I will do those while highlighting this discrepancy between Arab public opinion and the positions of Arab officials. With regard to democracy and political participations, the findings show an interesting temporal trend, where the Arab Spring or the 2011 uprisings kind of show a turning point. We saw that the surveys that the Arab Opinion Index conducted immediately after 2011, like 2012 and 2013, 2014, the people expressed more positive assessment of governments, more positive assessment of the freedoms they have in their countries, and more interest in political affairs and in the political process, like voting. Towards 2015 until today, this has dropped. This positive sentiments about the political climate, the positivity of the political climate has dropped. And we see that people lost confidence in probably after seeing the aftermath of the Arab Spring, where it became clear that the mass protests did not yield the democratic outcome that was desired. And this is essentially a question of political efficacy versus apathy. Part of the reason why so many people across the Arab world, and particularly young people, are not interested in political affairs or in voting is because they don't feel that their contribution or their participation will make a difference. And that's clearly seen in what happened in Egypt. This would explain the astonishingly low turnout levels in the elections that happened in the last few months in different Arab countries. But also it would explain what the Arab Opinion Index found this year, that social and political engagements remain really low. We have 12% who report membership in political parties, 16% in social organizations, and 9% in religious organizations, which are still very low for a predominantly young population. And despite this political apathy, the Arab public still believes in democracy, as we've seen from the data. They have conceptually a very solid understanding of what democracy means in terms of political participation and equality for all citizens and civil liberties. And this is, despite that, the authoritarian status quo persists. And what is important here, we really haven't seen any serious reform or change happen. And from Saudi Arabia to Tunisia, the people in power still have to address the needs and aspirations of their people. Why is this discrepancy important? This gap between the public's aspirations and political efficacy is potentially going to implode. It's problematic. When people have decreased efficacy, they feel whatever they do is not going to make a difference. They lose faith in the political process, or that their participation in the political process will make any difference at all. We see what is happening in the Arab world now. We see increase in violence. We see the vacuum being exploited by state and non-state external actors, and we see increase in extremist ideologies. And this is one of the reasons why US policy would benefit from addressing these issues rather than looking at the Arab world from a narrow perspective, transactional perspective. Briefly, also, what I find interesting has to do with the phenomenon of political polarization. We've seen for decades the Arab world kind of divided between the repressive regimes that have control and power on one side, and Islamist movements that are kind of the only organized opposition that existed. And both of them kind of have little tolerance of the other or of the opposition. And what we see in the data, I think, might be signaling a shift. We might be beginning to see an end to this polarization. More than half of the Arab public do not feel represented by existing political parties or groups. And I think this is interesting. It's an interesting trend to follow in the coming years, and it's probably an opportunity for a shift in the political landscape, and there may be opportunity for other political structures to arise, especially in countries where there's open accessibility to activism and political expression, and particularly the emerging of an online political sphere where the public has spaces to discuss these issues. And clearly this is not only a benefit for the region, it's the benefit for the United States to have that support for democratization in the region. The issue of Palestine, briefly, without repeating what has been said, Over the last weeks, we've seen the Trump administration's Middle East peace team shop around the deal of the century to Arab leaders. And there's been a lot of speculation whether the Arab leaders are going to pressure the Palestinians or whether they would go with the administration's plan that was leaked by some reports here and there. What is remarkable about this deal is the profound lack of understanding of what the Palestinian people want. But not only that, it largely underestimates how the Arab people feel about Palestine. I agree with Shibley that we still need to test behavioral intentions. We might know that the Arab public has expressed support for the Palestinian cause, but we don't know how far they're willing to go if their governments would support a U.S. brokered deal that would deny Palestinians their right to statehood and so on. So I think we can add maybe a test of behavioral intentions to the survey in the next years, because attitudes are one thing, but how far people are willing to go to act on those attitudes is also an important aspect to measure. And here again, with the issue of Palestine, we see that the main players, who are the Palestinians, who are supposed to be carrying out the implementation or the realization of whatever peace deal is agreed upon, are being completely ignored. And it's counterproductive, obviously, and the Trump administration would benefit from really understanding the real concerns of the Palestinian people, which I may add are not economic, like the Trump's peace team might think. When we look at the Arab public, just throughout the years since polling started in the Arab world, the data has been telling us the same thing all along, and we see this a little bit here in the Arab Opinion Index today. The question of Palestine is a central issue, and it remains a central issue for the Arab people. It's an issue of justice that the Arabs see, or lack thereof, in U.S. approaches to the region. And that's why it remains an important factor driving developments in the region, from recruitment by extremist violent groups to regional stability, Arab attitudes toward the United States, and even U.S. national security. We've heard this from Osama bin Laden himself about the U.S. policy towards Palestine. So what does this all mean for U.S. policy? I'll end quickly here. It's no surprise that Arab attitudes towards U.S. policy are negative overwhelmingly. We've seen that in surveys throughout the years. What I find interesting is that it's been getting worse. So if we look at the Arab Opinion Index data in 2014, 49% viewed U.S. policy negatively. That went up to 65% in 2015, 77% in 2016, and 79% in this year's survey, which is a negative trend that is developing, and probably in no small part due to the current administration in the White House. But with a population of over 420 million people that is overwhelmingly young, a strategic geography and a significance for the global affairs, that the United States cannot afford to ignore the views of those 400 or so million people. And just to end quickly, the Arab public opinion doesn't matter for the United States only from the narrow national security or counterterrorism perspective. Obviously, values like democracy, political participation, and economic development are important soft power tools that the United States has in its role in global leadership, and that's diminishing these days. But also, and I guess I have to say this in this day and age, democracy, equality, and human rights are also important values to support in themselves. Thank you.
Thank you to all three for your great presentation. Now we will spend the balance of our time in questions and answers. There are cards on your seats with pencils there. If you would like to ask a question, please indicate your name, your affiliation, and who you want your question directed to. Let me start while I'm waiting for the card. Just raise your hand. Staff will pick him up and bring him over. And the first question I'd like to ask is to Dana, with regard to the discrepancy between Arab attitude toward U.S. foreign policy and toward the American people. Where does it stand in the 2017, 2018? I remember in the past it was a rather visible difference, attitudes toward the U.S. Policy versus attitude toward the American people.
Yes, so I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. But yes, there's a huge discrepancy between what do you think of Americans and what do you think of American foreign policy? What do you think of the U.S. and what do you think of the U.S. foreign policy towards Palestine, towards Syria, towards Iraq? There's a huge discrepancy. I can send that around after the presentation. Maybe we'll post it again on the website. I just don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but like you said, it's a large gap.
Okay, thank you. The first question from Voice of America, Mohammed Shinawi, addressed to Professor Telhami. How do you explain the high percentage of political apathy in the Arab world that was just referred to by Tamara, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question because in some ways that apathy question may be a better indicator than asking people directly about what they think of the governments or politics, because there, as Dana said, sometimes in all authoritarian cases, indirect questions are better indicators than direct questions for telling you, giving you, sort of where people are. In this particular case, I think probably it's their relevance that we see in the Arab world. People think that they don't matter. Now, having said that, let's not forget that we have apathy here too in America. In democratic countries, not quite that high, obviously, but look at the percentage of people who actually vote in our elections. So it is comparatively higher in the Arab world, not uncommon, but particularly high. And it's reinforced by another question that they had asked specifically about whether they participate in various, politics directly or religious organizations or other things where the numbers are very low. So the public is not part of the political system. They don't feel part of the political system. That's the way to read it, I think.
If I can just,
Sure, go ahead.
add to that as well. We also have questions where in different countries, especially if they have, let's say parliamentary elections or municipal elections coming up, we'll ask them, what's important in a candidate? Why would you vote? Why would you not vote? And it's always the response is, my vote doesn't matter. The candidates are not participating in a free election. They're all the same. So it's like you said, that they don't feel represented by the systems, which is why we see political apathy. In particular countries, we see, like Tamara said, polarization between those who are politically apathetic and those who care about politics. And that has to do with particular groups in society being repressed and not having, let's say, in the Egyptian case, representation in, Mohammed Morsi, for example. But yeah, sorry, exactly what you said.
Okay, the next question is from Saeed Arakat, Al-Quds, to Dana. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the methods used to conduct this opinion poll, and particularly, again, a little bit more on the numbers of people surveyed in each country or in the whole survey in general?
Okay, so I don't have specific numbers for each country right in front of me, but what we do is basically these are face-to-face interviews. So I don't know how much in depth I should get, but we'll have like a particular part of a map. We make sure that we get the urban and rural percentage that reflects the country that we're working in. Oftentimes we have local partners, so they're also they've done surveys in their own contexts in the past, and these are face-to-face interviews. So our researchers will go house to house, randomly picking particular houses, and so it's the best way to attempt to get an accurate assessment of, let's say, the Egyptian sample or the Moroccan sample. Sorry, could you read the question again? I forgot the second half.
Basically in terms of but the overall
the
numbers,
total.
the total was 18,000, right?
18,000,
Is what you said.
2,830 to
Yeah.
be specific.
You went door to door in Saudi Arabia and in Iraq and in Mauritania?
No, so in Iraq, Mauritania, in all of the countries except Saudi Arabia this year, it was face-to-face. In Saudi Arabia, we had to rely on phone interviews for the safety of our interlocutors and our local partners. And so we usually don't rely on phone interviews in any previous survey, but we decided that if we wanted to get some assessment of Saudi Arabian public opinion, even though, like Dr. Shibley noted, we had high non-response rates, but even those kinds of findings are interesting. And what questions are Saudis finding difficult to answer? We thought we might as well at least attempt with the phone survey. But in Mauritania, in Iraq, our local partners did go door to door. Yes.
If I may, you might want to note that about the fact that Saudi Arabia was by phone, because it's not noted in the
Okay.
in the methodological statement. That's important information, obviously.
Yeah. I think the main results.
And I assume that's conducted from outside the country?
So it's sometimes. So basically, as to not bias the sample, sometimes it'll have Saudi phone numbers. Sometimes it'll have other phone numbers from other places. So it's also randomized in that sense. So we don't want people to get the sense that where's the source of this. It's kind of randomized.
Okay, Tamara, this question is for you from Tom Frank, Arab Weekly. Would you care to comment on the decline in Arab attitudes toward the U.S. in terms of this administration versus the previous one, the Obama administration?
I think the numbers show that early on under the Obama administration, the Arab public had hope in President Obama for change, and I think the Cairo speech by the president kind of perpetuated that feeling of optimism about a shift in U.S. policy towards the Arab world. And towards the end of the Obama administration, I think this started to shift. But more recently now, under the Trump administration, we see it that it's becoming more and more negative. And I am guessing that in next year and the year after, the Arab Opinion Index will probably find more negative assessments of U.S. foreign policy by the Arab public.
This question is from William Lawrence, George Washington University, to Dana and Shibley. I assume you might want to also comment on that one. If you were to compare this survey or this poll with previous ones, without necessarily mentioning by name the previous surveys, where do you see the deficiencies in the past, or the deficiencies between this and other surveys, and why we did not see Yemen included, right? Why is, or other GCC countries included?
Okay, so in terms of, again, like you said, without mentioning names, some surveys, they will translate. So they'll have the same question that they'll use in Eastern Europe and parts of Africa to the Middle East. We think that's kind of problematic. Some surveys, just for sheer lack, not because the survey itself is bad or the people who are doing it are like not careful, but they may have less access. So they might 1 year do Tunisia, and another year they'll do Egypt. So it's not consistent. So we feel like our survey is at least the most consistent since 2011. We have the same. I mean, there was a bit of a learning curve, I think, in the first 2 years, but basically we have the same concepts. We're testing the same concepts over time, trying to get the same countries to the best of our ability given the context. So that I would say is our comparative advantage. And we also, again, it's like Arab-led. So our partners are all local. The way that we conduct our testing for questions or things like that, it's using local focus groups, these kinds of things. So that always kind of increases the external validity of the results. Yes, the GCC question, GCC other countries. So it really depends on the access in any given year. It's very difficult for us to do something in Oman. Bahrain is a blockading country. It's very difficult. Like, we don't want to put anyone at risk. Qatar, for example, we've asked we're in the process of attempting to get official, what's the word in English? Approval. We're trying to get a permit to do these kinds of surveys because we're based in Qatar and we don't want to get in trouble. But that's a work in progress. So it really has to do with just what access we have available.
Yeah, just to add, in terms of the comparison of, when I did the polls for 10 years, we did 6 countries, a smaller sample. They're all face-to-face, by the way, because we thought that was, in the Arab world, that's the most credible way to do it. We did a sample typically 3,000 to 3,500 in 6 countries, so a smaller sample, also in depth. Right now, there are, the global ones, as Dana pointed out, they're motivated by something different because they're taking general questions, comparing them globally. Pew does that very well. Occasionally, Gallup does some of those global comparisons. In the Arab world specifically, you don't have many. You have the Arab Barometer, which is pretty, it's good quality, good people behind it, thoughtfully conceived, but not the same types of questions. Some of them pertaining to democracy and religion particularly. But it's another good one to look at. The Arab American Institute carried out by Zagbi Analytics, they still do an occasional one. Those are also focused on it. So this one, in terms of the poll itself, is far more extensive and much larger size in many more countries, focused on specifically questions that pertain to the region. In terms of results, there isn't anything that is dramatically different from prior years, and that itself is interesting because it was expected that there's been a transformation. That's been the argument, that the Middle East has been transformed, that the priorities have shifted, that everything is different. Well, it doesn't look like that, except with some few exceptions that I mentioned in my analysis. So in that sense, just the mere confirmation of public opinion as it is a story in and of itself.
This question is from Orinir, Americans for Peace Now. Who in Palestine was questioned? West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Israel, inside 48 Palestinians. Can you break down political apathy, and maybe you want to comment on that particular part of the question in Palestine? Is it on the increase, and why? Any other characteristics that are unique to the Palestinian, respondents to this survey?
So we've surveyed people in Gaza and the West Bank. We don't survey people in East Jerusalem or Arab al-Dakhil, so not within historic Palestine. And we do have breakdowns in terms of how people from the West Bank answer versus how the Gazans answer. I don't have those breakdowns in front of me, but one of the analysis pieces that I mentioned is particularly on this topic, on Palestinian public opinion. You can find it open access on Al-Muntaqa. Sorry, can I read the question, the second half of the question?
The second part pertained to the political apathy. Is it increasing at this time?
I don't want to answer incorrectly because I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. But what is interesting about the Palestine sample is that people feel a lot more repressed than we would think, not just from the occupation, but from the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas government in Gaza. So, like Dr. Telhami was noting, people can't really criticize the government freely, just as bad almost as Sudan. So that's kind of a trend that people may be missing in Palestine. We may think that because Palestinians are, they're protesters and things like that, that they have a little bit more freedom of expression. But what we know in terms of the context of the case with laws like the cybercrime law and things like that, actually Palestinians are feeling a lot more repressed than they ever have.
If I may, just on this
Sure.
one question, you're probably right, because I think most people probably would have understood by Palestinian government, meaning Palestinian Authority. But because people are under occupation, it's sometimes hard to tell. And I wish in that particular case there was a clearer breakdown. That might be, there may have been people who understood the occupation authorities as the government.
No, we asked
You asked that specifically?
about the Sultan. We asked
So
specifically
what
about the
was the
Palestinian
question?
Authority.
Because you have a general question to everybody at the same time, saying government.
So when we put government, in Egypt it'll be
The
the
Egyptian
government,
government.
the Egyptian government. In Palestine it would be the Palestinian Authority. So
Okay.
it's
Well, that's good
we
too.
try to make it as consistent as possible across different countries, but that's sometimes in testing and things like that we have to specify, like you said. Otherwise people will misunderstand.
This question is from Greg Aftandilian regarding, addressed to all three panelists, how much has Trump's decision on Jerusalem affected negative views of Arabs toward U.S. policy? Can you quantify that?
So in the one of the slides that I showed, from 2016 to the 2017-2018 survey, it jumped from 79% to 87%. That's a big shift, statistically speaking. In terms of how Arabs perceive U.S. foreign policy towards Palestine, it has increased in negativity. And like I said, big shift. 79 to 87 is not an inconsequential amount.
Any
other comments? Okay.
I don't know how much we can attribute of that shift to the Jerusalem decision, but it probably did contribute significantly to that.
Okay. Richard Sawaya, National Foreign Trade Council. Given Arab antipathy toward Iran and the U.S. and Israel, what do you think the Arab street reaction would be to war between Iran and a U.S.-Israeli force? Addressed to Shibley.
war between Iran and Israel?
Iran and U.S.-Israel combination.
Yeah, my own view is that most people don't want to see it. Now, you have to remember, again, we're talking here about public opinion versus governments, and you know that there are governments in the Arab world who want to see such a confrontation. But it might surprise you to know that even among the anti-Iran coalition in the Arab world that is taking place, that includes Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, there is not unanimity of view on the confrontation of Iran. The Egyptians don't want to see war with Iran. They just decidedly don't want to see war with Iran. They see Iran as a menace. They want Iran contained. They see Iran as a troublemaker. But even the Egyptian government, let alone the Egyptian people, don't want to see confrontation. So my own view is that most people don't want to see such a confrontation. Some people probably do. Hard to tell. I think in the past, I may have asked about that in one of the questions. I so vaguely remember something related to that in the past, but my guess is that I don't think you'd find much support for that.
Okay, there's a question regarding the demographic background of the participants in terms of socioeconomic status. How were the participants selected? Level of education of participants? How does the demographic change from year to year? Addressed to Dana. This is from Elizabeth Myers, Inside Arabia, an online magazine called Inside Arabia.
So basically what we try to do is we try to, in each country sample, we try to reflect the demographic conditions on the ground. So if, let's say, 92% of the country lives in an urban area and 8% lives in a rural area, that's the demographic breakdown that we try to have in the sample. So it kind of differs country by country. Again, I don't have all the stats off the top of my head. But if we try to equally balance it on gender, we try to reflect how the population looks in terms of educational level and all of the other demographic factors that might be relevant.
All right. Alexandra Eaton, American University. In terms of Arab identity being more important than national lines, I assume that's the word lines or positions, are there significant differences by country, age, et cetera?
So you guys are asking a lot of detailed questions that are like in the full 350-page report. I'm sorry, I don't have it memorized, but I think that from what I remember, is that the majority in all countries finds that the Arabs constitute a single nation. There are particular countries, like I said, maybe the ones that are correlated with more internal conflict, that have slightly lower rates of people who think that the Arabs constitute a single nation. But I don't, I can't off the top of my head give you that information. Now, the full report, all 350 pages broken down by demographics, broken down by country, is available on the website. It is in Arabic right now, but it is in progress for translating. Our translators are hard at work, so just give it a little bit of time, and we'll be sure to provide that access.
In terms of identity, though, this is something that I've researched extensively. I have a book on identity as well in the Arab world and its relationship to foreign policy. We've done a lot of polling over the years, specifically to probe how identity is shifting or not shifting in the Arab world. And we do find shifts, but one of the interesting things is that over the years, Arabs have been, no single identity, whether it's state versus Arab versus religious identity, has gotten a majority. And so you have plurality shifting. So sometimes you'd have the state getting 35% or 40% of people. Sometimes you have Islamic identity rising to 40%. Sometimes you have Arab identity rising. So we all three identities have remained robust. All three identities have remained robust throughout the entire period that we've done polling, with varying degrees. So there was a rise in Islamic identity at the expense of state identity a little bit after 9/11 for a variety of reasons, because identity is dynamic and most of it is defined in relationship to another and a sense of threat. A sense of threat to Islamic identity after 9/11 because of the way people interpreted American foreign policy and the war on terrorism as an anti-Islamic war. There was a reaction that bolstered the sense of identity. Identity is dynamic. People, if they say I'm first an Egyptian today, doesn't mean they say they're Arab less or Muslim less or Christian less. Let's keep that in mind. So it is, all these things remain strong even as one rises a little bit above the others. Every indication we have in previous studies shows that.
Yeah, it's not zero sum.
Question regarding the issue of support of ISIS. Nizar Farsakh wants to be assured that you didn't ask the question, are you supportive of ISIS? Because the assumption here is that very few people will be able to answer
Obviously
this one, or be afraid to do so.
Yeah, no, obviously, like I said, like direct questions, that would be kind of a ridiculous one. But direct questions can be kind of a basis, and then we break it down. For example, we'll tell them, so what do you think ISIS objectives are? Why do you think that they emerged? And they say, oh, because of a political vacuum, or because of religious fundamentalism, or whatever. And so from those kinds of questions, we can kind of understand, where they themselves stand and how they perceive this group. But yeah, direct questions are not always great, but we do sometimes have to ask them to just kind of establish a baseline.
All right, so we didn't ask for IDs, membership IDs. Sami Tayyib, independent researcher, is asking, did you find any correlation between increasing debt obligations among respondents and the depoliticization of the Arab public, particularly with regard with the issue of Palestine?
So that actually is, it's a theory that's been posited, I think, by Tawfiq Haddad. His new book is Palestine Ltd. But I haven't looked at the correlation of that. We know that economic fears and we do have questions on things like how do you supplement your income? Is the income enough for you? Where are you getting the rest of it? Is it family? Is it loans? Is it things like that? So that kind of data could be easily looked at and correlated, but I haven't looked at it specifically. But that's definitely been a reoccurring argument in the literature on Palestine. So it would be interesting to kind of look into it and see the empirics.
Okay, Shibley, that's a question for you from Ran Jibril, AAI, with regards to the media that was referred to on several occasions during this panel. And are people in the Arab world less and less relying less and less on the media after all the kind of confusion in the coverage these days with regards to issues like Syria, the Assad regime, this and that?
That's a really good question. Let's put it this way. When in the polling that I've done all the way through 2012, what we did find is that people were relying less and less on television, although television was still number one as a source of news, because we asked, we did extensive media analysis, meaning we didn't only ask what is your main source of news, we asked what is your main source of news on international politics, on domestic politics, on the question of Palestine specifically. We asked how many hours a day do you watch or a week do you watch a television station. We asked about specific television stations. We correlated that with opinion. So we did some extensive work on media, and what we've seen, obviously, the sudden rise really in between 2000, particularly between 2006, 2007, and 2010, 2011, sudden rise in the importance of the internet and social media as an alternative to television as a source of news, particularly among the younger generation and especially in the wealthier Arab countries. So and obviously what we see here is a confirmation of that, because the two wealthiest countries in this report, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, you find an increasing use of the reliance on internet as opposed to television as a source of news. And that probably is in part because of A, the availability to them, obviously, that's one, but B, the fact that there is a mistrust of regional media. I think what has happened really in the past 3-4 years is that the press has been far more representative of government positions than it had been the previous 5 years. I mean, this is one of the, and that's noticeable in every country. And in that sense, I think there is a degree of mistrust. I think Syria, the Syrian crisis, where the media was so heavily involved in reporting it, and it's a divisive issue and painful issue in the Arab world, I think generated also suspicion toward the media. And so, yes, I think there's considerable suspicion. The real question is, how governments see the role of the media. And that, I think, is the big story of our time, because you have, in a way, a brazen attempt to control the information revolution in the Arab world by governments saying, look, the free market cannot produce a strong enough media outlet because there's not enough advertising, and so all of them will have to rely on government funding. And we are the government, so let's find that we can control the media and then shape public opinion, because that is the best way to assure that the public will support us. So there's an attempt in some ways to a theory about control of media, and obviously it's intruding into the social media, not just through, we know all these clandestine operations that we're now finding out, whether it's with regard to Russia or regard to Israel or regard to the Arab states, that is an attempt essentially to influence even the discourse on the social media by targeting people and shaping public opinion. So we have something extraordinary going on. That is really the big story of our time when it comes to public opinion. We don't know how it's going to play itself out. Those of us who are optimistic the information revolution is going to create an independent public opinion that is going to influence the governments are now going through a lot of rethinking, because the governments still dominate the sources of power, whether it's financial or military or political, and they are using them to manipulate sources of information in ways that we had never seen before, including in democratic countries. So imagine how it is in authoritarian countries. So that is really a huge question.
Shibley, in this regard, does the quality of the media, is that an important factor? I mean, I've been a student of the Middle East for 50 years. there are some of the largest or richest or largest in terms of size countries that over this whole period hasn't been able to produce one decent newspaper or one decent satellite station that people can watch for legitimate and serious news coverage. So what do they watch? Well, I mean, we blame them for using this source or that source or going to a foreign media for their source of information. But isn't that a factor in deciding how people flock or do not flock to certain media?
Sure. I think there is very little original reporting in much of the media, as you know. If you look at the newspapers, and much of it is secondhand or third-hand, you learn very little except stories that are not particularly interesting to a larger audience. So that is by design. Mm-hmm. It's not that is by design. It's not something that is a function of inability. There are so many talented journalists in the Arab world. I can't tell you. I mean, you've met, you know how many people out there who are extremely talented. We've seen them operate when they're given the opportunity to operate. It's by design. It's when you've got people who have to toe the line, they have to toe the line. They have to survive, and it's not going to. I still think, though, that. When you're talking about critical issues today, something related to war and peace, something related to identity, something related to Palestine, Iran, the U.S., those are all big-time issues, that the public isn't necessarily looking for accurate information. The public is looking for confirmation of their identity. And so they go to media outlets that already pitch their story. And we see it here. The Fox News watcher is going to Fox because Fox confirms what she or he already think. And the same thing with MSNBC. And this is a polarization that's taken place worldwide. We see it in the information bubbles on the internet and social media where people go to those things that make them feel comfortable rather than those things that will give them additional information. This is something we're all grappling with. We're all figuring out, and that's why politicians know exactly which buttons to push. And that's why Cambridge Analytica and others, they're going to see what is it that is motivating you? What is your identity? What is the issue that resonates with you? Let's go there and sneak in the information that we want to sneak in, and that's the way it works.
All right, final word from Dana. William Lawrence will not let me go out to lunch if I don't ask his question. He noticed that the use of Arab Spring or Arab uprisings in the questions. What did the respondents use or prefer?
So in Arabic, it's Rabi' al-Arabi. No, I think this is a translation. So basically, we do have questions on the Arab Spring. But I think in the translation into the English, we sometimes get a little we get a little
Use
sloppy
both.
with the terms. But in Arabic, it's Rabi' al-Arabi, which is, I guess, Arab Spring is the most accurate. Yeah.
All right, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it. Thank you.